Let's start with P&O Ferries. Next month will mark 2 years since 786 Dover to Calais workers discovered they were being fired with immediate effect. They were replaced by a new, cheaper crew working longer hours without breaks. The company said the sackings were essential to keep the route running, but the brutal layoffs caused outrage across the country. Here's a reminder of how some of them learned they were out of work.
The company has made the decision that its vessels going forward will be primarily crewed by a third-party crew provider. Therefore, I am sorry to inform you that this means your employment is terminated with immediate effect on the grounds of redundancy. Your final day of employment is today.
Well, John Lansdowne was one of those sacked workers. In fact, he's the only one of those seafarers who didn't take a payoff and sign away his right to speak out, choosing instead to take legal action against P&O Ferries and eventually forcing them to admit unfair dismissal. Welcome, John. Thank you for joining us. As I say, we're nearly 2 years on now. How do you feel? Is it still raw?
Yes, very much so. Not just for myself, but for all my colleagues and friends that went through the same experience. They weren't just jobs on P&O Ferries, they were very much part of our lives. We spent half the year with those people that we worked with on the ships. You know, we laughed together, we argued together, we got through COVID together. Very much part of our identity. They were like a second family, and everything that we held dear to us as seafarers was valued by the management of P&O Ferries at precisely zero and broken and thrown away.
And we saw the video there of how some people found out they were losing their jobs. Just take us back to that moment when you found out.
My world had been turned upside down. I mean, there was grown adults walking around the ship that day crying. They'd lost everything. And we've given the best years of our working lives to that company. Some people chose a career with P&O over having a family, and then that happens to them. You know, it's just so hard to, it was a betrayal, and the ultimate betrayal, because we were so proud to work for that once great iconic organisation. And we're angry with the people that have done this. This Dubai government-owned parent company of P&O's, I mean, their behaviour is nothing short of disgraceful, along with Peter Hebblethwaite and the rest of the board of P&O Ferries who sanctioned this.
And you were the only one out of all of your colleagues who decided not to take the payoff and decided to speak out because you didn't have to sign a document like your colleagues did, limiting what you could say. Why did you decide to take the company on?
Because this was never about money or anything like that. This was always about justice. This was about principle. This was about right and wrong. This was about holding to account those people who think they can just disregard the law, in this case P&O. They brazenly broke employment law because they knew they could. They knew they could calculate with precision exactly what it would cost them to buy themselves out of any meaningful sanction.
It's a huge amount to do though, isn't it? It's a lot to take on a company of that size.
Yeah, of course, and you're not just taking on P&O Ferries, you're taking on their parent company, DP World, who have got unbelievable resources. They're owned by the Dubai government, but you're also against the establishment and the whole process through the tribunal service. It's stacked against the employee seeking justice. Everything is against you. It's not an uphill struggle, it's an up the face of the mountain struggle.
And it's been tough emotionally.
Yeah, I mean, the impact after this, since we won the tribunal case against P&O Ferries, it's been very tough. Post that, it's just been so stressful. But again, it's not just about me, because there isn't a day that goes by where I don't either hear or see about the very real impact that the actions of P&O Ferries has had on the mental and physical well-being of very many of my former colleagues.
You'll remember the outrage at the time, and at the time the government said that P&O Ferries would not be allowed to get away with their actions. We're nearly 2 years on now. How do you feel reflecting on that?
Well, despite all of the hand-wringing that happened at the time, because this was never party political, this united all the parties in Westminster in condemnation of P&O. What we've seen since then is the Seafarers Wages Bill, which frankly isn't worth the paper it's written on. One of the reasons for that, it's not enforceable because there's no one to enforce it. They've actually farmed out the responsibility for enforcement to port operators. So as an example, port in Tilbury and in Southampton that is operated by Dubai-owned DP World. They're the parent company of P&O Ferries, and this is the reason we've got the seafarers' wages bill in the first place. And there's no meaningful sanction in place against those who choose to disregard the law or break employment law. When this bill was going through Parliament at committee stage, there was amendments tabled by the opposition parties, Labour and the SNP, that would have given this legislation real teeth. One of the amendments was to hold to account the directors of law-breaking and unscrupulous employers. Unfortunately, the Conservative MPs voted against this amendment, which would have had, like I say, given it real teeth, real impetus.
The government says it's reacted swiftly and decisively, and that this legislation, which enforces them to pay equivalent to the UK national minimum wage, that will protect UK seafarers. There were other promises made by the government as well, and claims of prosecuting the company. How do you feel about that now?
So they said they'd asked the Insolvency Service to launch a criminal investigation against P&O Ferries and the directors. That was dropped in August 2022. There's still a civil investigation ongoing, and it's nearly 2 years now. And the burden of proof for a civil matter is much lower than a criminal matter, but it's nearly 2 years. I mean, I know the Insolvency Service, they haven't got the resources that they need, but that's for the Westminster government to address. But I'm like I say, I'm really disappointed with those Conservative MPs that voted against that amendment that would have given this bill real teeth by holding the directors of unscrupulous employers accountable. Unfortunately, Sally Ann was one of those MPs. But when this started, it wasn't party political at all. Every single person who spoke in the House of Commons that day condemned P&O Ferries, from the Tories to Labour to the SNP to the DUP. It's one of the first times ever that the whole House was united in condemnation.
We'll bring the politicians in just a second, but I wonder, you've been speaking to your former colleagues who can't speak out themselves. Can you be a voice for them? Can you tell us how they're feeling?
I try to represent them as best as I can. There's many of them that are really suffering from significant mental health issues as a result of P&O Ferries' unscrupulous actions on 17th of March 2022.
And what do they think about the government's response and what's happened since?
They're so disappointed. They are so disappointed. They believed Boris Johnson. They believed Grant Shapps, because there was so much outrage and hand-wringing. And because of the brazen, arrogant approach that P&O Ferries took to breaking the employment law, I think everyone felt, hang on, something's going to happen here. This will bring about meaningful change. But it's yet to happen. Actually, the opposite's happened. Last year, in August, it was widely reported that the UK government have rewarded P&O Ferries and their owners, DP World, to the tune of £230 million of taxpayers' money. That's not holding into account a corporate lawbreaker.
Okay, Sally Ann.
So, and obviously I'm appalled, like everybody else was, about P&O's actions, and I know the government did take very swift action. The Secretary of State for Transport at the time came up with a package of 9 measures to, one of them was the minimum wage. We had changes announced to encourage ferry companies to fly under a British flag to make it more easily, British law to apply to them.
And have all those 9 measures, have they been achieved? Have they been completed?
I don't know, Charlotte. I don't know if they've been achieved. I know that one of the measures was the Seafarers Wages Act, which has become an act. It's enacted, and that's ensuring a minimum wage for seafarers. It's to improve their employment conditions, their welfare and everything else. I know the governments have brought out a Seafarers Charter. France has done the same thing. It's about encouraging operators to do the right thing for their staff. And they're also working on a worldwide agreement with the International Industrial Organisation to get worldwide agreement on employment competitions improvement, but also on an international minimum wage.
We're nearly 2 years on, and the government made these promises. Shouldn't they have done this by now? You know, it's quite a long time for people like John to wait.
It is a long time, and I understand that, and I know the legal process takes a long time very often when they're investigating. I understand that the investigation, it wasn't pulled, it just didn't come up with enough evidence in order to have a successful prosecution, which is why, that's what I've read, it's why the civil action is, civil investigation is still going ahead, and I'm interested to see the outcome of that. I think that's important.
The government said that it was going to review all arrangements with the company, but the Ministry of Defence is still spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on P&O ferry tickets, and they say they're going to continue to do it.
This is a private business, and
but the government doesn't have to use them.
They don't have to use them, but we've still got P&O based in Dover. I understand what you're saying, but Dover Port has employment. We want to make sure we keep employment going in Dover Port. So it's actually very important to make sure that those businesses continue and don't.
Mike, what's Labour going to do about this?
Well, first, thank you to John for everything you're doing for those 800 workers and for standing up for working people. I think it's been absolutely fantastic, and I've got your back, and the Labour Party have certainly got John's back. And
how? What will you do?
Firstly, Peter Hebblethwaite, this civil action has dragged on for far too long, and Labour have committed to put that pressure on to speed up that investigation. Grant Shapps has said a lot of good things when he was in that role, but hasn't delivered on them, and we certainly will. And then for working people, look, with a Labour Party, it's what we do. We will stand up for them. So we will bring in new laws with the New Deal for working people, and that includes outlawing fire and rehire, which is what the Conservatives have completely failed to do, and that will stop this sort of thing from happening again. So employers will not be able to go to their staff with new contracts that are worse than the one they've signed and threaten them with sacking if they don't sign them.
P&O Ferries say the sackings were necessary in order to make the route viable.
Well, they weren't necessary at all. And what you can't do is bring in essentially exploited workers to replace workers who they should be paying the minimum wage. That's not the way this country works. That is not British. If anything, I'd call that anti-British, and they do not have the right to operate in that way.
Okay, well, look, let's give the last...
This is why we brought in the Seafarers Wages Act, to ensure that crew on ferries do get paid at least the minimum wage. That's what we've done.
Okay.
And unfortunately it's not working, so...
All right, let's bring in John then. Just finally, tell us what's your message to the government. If they're watching now, what would you like them to hear?
My message to the government, or any future Labour government, is these measures. First of all, we need to outlaw the scourge of fire and rehire. Make it illegal. Second thing that needs to happen is any legislation that's there to protect seafarers has got to have teeth. Strengthen the legislation by making the directors personally liable for any breaches of the employment law. You make the fines in the millions. They're at the thousands now. Make them big fines. So that's it really help them to focus minds before they embark on law breaking. Thirdly, the Seafarers Charter. That's currently voluntary. Make it mandatory. If you want to be a regular operator in and out of UK ports, that has got to be mandatory, and you've got to sign up to all the steps on that Seafarers Charter.
Okay.
And fourthly, if I may, we need a single enforcement body in this country that enforces workers' rights. And this is something the Conservatives promised in their 2019 manifesto. We've yet to see it materialise.
Okay. All right, John, thank you so much for coming in. We really appreciate you coming in to talk to us and tell us your story. Now, we should say that P&O Ferries have apologised for the distress caused by the sackings, but say they were necessary to save the business, including 2,200 jobs in coastal communities across the UK.